Hi, everyone, and welcome to this edition of the NGINX Community Chats. Today, we're coffee klatching on open source and standards here at F5. From the German, Coffee Klatch means coffee and gossip. And as the name implies, this is an informal chat. During this time, you're going to get a chance to hear about some things that are open sourcey, meet some of the people behind open source inside and outside of F5 and NGINX, and maybe even learn something new. I'm Dave McAllister. I'm the open source technologist here at NGINX, part of F5. And with me today is F5 distinguished engineer Joel Moses.
Hello, Dave. How are you?
Joel, thanks for joining us.
It's great to be here.
What do you do here at F5?
What do I do here at F5? I do a little of everything, Dave. Mainly, I'm focused on experimentation and proof of concepts these days. Things with like a 2-year time horizon. I focus a lot on disruptive technologies, some deriving out of hardware, things like DPUs, which are exceptionally smart NICs and what we can do with those, and technologies that are born out of advancement in software like WebAssembly. It's a wide-ranging place that I get to play, which is great. And of course, with the NGINX team as well.
Yeah. My first introduction to you was during a discussion on WebAssembly. In fact, and we brought in an outside speaker. That was actually fascinating. And it's been most interesting watching as WebAssembly itself has evolved, as well as the involvement that F5 has picked up with WebAssembly. It is the technology that I personally say, if you don't know about it, 3 years from now, you will regret.
I'd absolutely agree with that.
Let's step back for a second here. You're one of the few people with a background in open source that rivals my own.
I don't know about that, Dave. I know your background, so man, you've had quite the career.
Correctly, you actually did something with Linux 093 in that time frame.
093, it's interesting. I related to open source. I didn't know that there was another way to do it other than open. The communities that I belonged to in the early days, there were two of them. There were the academic community, and sharing by default is what you do in academia. And then, I did a lot of work in the early days of bulletin board systems with bulletin board systems and coding for things like door games and stuff like that. And we did a lot of sharing back then in that community. But again, it was because of the insular nature of that community that people were simply more efficient and more effective if they shared with each other. So I kind of came about it in I guess you would call the proto or early days of open source. And then in the early days of the web technologies, I found myself having to do some work in NCSA HTTPD to try to get it to run on an HPUX machine. I found myself deeply embedded in the Linux kernel trying to get the TTYs, the TTY handling code straight so that I could do some multitasking with terminals. From the early days all the way through to today.
Yeah. I can sympathize. I remember dealing with file systems back in the Linux versions, and I still tell my horror stories about when they changed out the memory management subsystem in Linux and broke everything on scale. Everything worked perfectly, but if you tried to scale it, you were dead for that. But, I'm going to shift a little bit, but this is sort of a broader question. The time frame we're talking about preceded the concept of NGINX by about 10 years.
Sure.
Sorry, folks. Yes, we've earned our gray for this. And open source has changed. And you talked about how it was community and how it was very insular in many ways here. But what's your view of open source, particularly here at F5 these days?
That's a good question. Obviously, from F5's earliest instantiation, it wasn't much into open source, although it did do plenty of work inside of open standards. And some of the open standards, of course, are loosely attached to open source efforts, especially as you're producing reference designs or reference implementations of certain standards. I was a big proponent of the NGINX acquisition. I was a longstanding fan of NGINX and what NGINX was capable of doing. And I was impressed by the other projects that NGINX fostered as well. I would say that in terms of what F5 is today, in terms of where we intend to go in the future of open source at F5 is incredibly bright. I think you can expect in the coming 2 years, that you're going to see us contribute more often, be more present in open source communities, be at the core of various driving open standards. We're really passionate and we want to do some great things with WebAssembly here at F5. And so I personally am placing a lot of importance in helping and foster that community and support it in any way that we can. So it's bright.
You know, there's a lot of projects, and everybody, I'm on the NGINX side, but I also have been sort of into the F5 side, thanks to your efforts, partially in that the standards functionality.
Mm-hmm.
For those of you who don't know, I do have a background in standards, though I tend to not claim it very often. I am a standards wonk and an open source geek. But if there's a project internally that you would want to call out, that's not the core web server, what would it be?
That's a great question. There's so much to choose from. It's really hard for me to pick. I'm of course really impressed by the thought that went into NGINX Unit and the way NGINX Unit adopted and fostered WebAssembly in its runtime core. I'm really impressed by the engineering that Elijah and team did on the S3 proxy, which is available as free open source. I think that's a fantastic thing. I think on the F5 side, a lot of people don't know how the arenas in which we choose to participate and drive forward the industry. We have for years contributed to TC39, which is the standards body inside of ECMA that fosters and cares for ECMAScript and JavaScript, to the point that a lot of what has gone into the language over the past few years, it started here at F5. And we're really proud of that work, and we want to see that work continue. A lot of hidden gems out there. I can't even point to one of them in particular that I'm most excited about. They're all cool to me.
Yeah, I'm going to point out one on your behalf here, since I have a background in observability and heavily into the tracing environments.
Oh, yeah.
Tracing increasingly massive amounts of data all over the place, and we did work to take the Arrow technology, the telemetry capabilities and protocol from that Apache Arrow project, and bring it to OpenTelemetry as a project in its own right. And that changes the nature of how we get data into our observability systems.
Yeah, it certainly does. And the team that's responsible for that, a lot of that work began in the office of the CTO, which I belong to. And the work that we've done in OpenTelemetry is hugely valuable and hugely important to our customers.
Yeah.
And it's great we're doing it in the open. It makes me comfortable, much more comfortable to release things and work on them in public.
Yeah, I'm also a firm believer that the telemetry should be as agnostic as possible. People should not be prevented from getting to their data in any way they want to. And then they get to choose how they want to analyze, aggregate, and display it.
I agree. That's what people really want. They don't necessarily want a single pane of glass. They've probably already chosen it. They just want you to reflect well in that single pane, right?
That's a lovely way of saying it, and I may steal that in the future for some of my observability talks here. So open source in general, actually, standards has had a little bit of this, but not to the same level. But open source in general has had some interesting times recently. We've seen open source projects relicensed. We've seen abandoned projects. We've seen deliberate sabotage of abandoned projects for this. And now we've got massive amounts of security concerns coming in here.
Yeah.
But rather than just an F5 or NGINX approach, though I'd love to hear how we're approaching it as well, what could companies be doing better to help extend the innovation and collaboration that open source brings into play?
That's a great question. And yeah, you're right. We have seen plenty of impact by abandoned projects, things that were linked to within JavaScript on lots of different websites, disappearing from a repository and breaking lots of things. We've, of course, seen takeover of projects by malicious actors.
Yep.
Here, what I would say is I placed a lot of hope in the efforts of OpenSSF. Curated out of the Linux Foundation. I think that a secure open source supply chain is achievable through cooperation. Unfortunately, I don't see a whole lot of progress on it. I would love to see a lot more. I'd love to see lots of things get better. Security concerns and making sure that open source projects have enough tools at their disposal that are familiar enough on the commercial side to do things like fuzz testing and bringing that forward into open source projects and making it a standard part of the way open source projects are developed. That would be a great idea, and I'd like to see that foster deeply into the community. But it's not going to get there without a significant amount of work.
That's true.
I think the insular nature of some of the open source communities is both a blessing and a curse. By being insular, it helps you with things like quality, and it helps you with speed and agility in what you deliver. But as time goes on and the code gets older and the repo sees less and less check-ins, the more tempting it is to simply walk away from that community, without regards of what dependencies have been made on that community. And that's been a constant challenge with open source. How do you curate things that are important but not modern enough to be exciting?
Okay, we always like to ask our guests this question. Okay, what's your favorite non-work related open source project?
Oh boy, I've got a lot of these, and I'm going to apologize in advance if I bring not just one but maybe two. I'm a big fan of a particular open source project called Home Assistant. Home Assistant is a really interesting toolkit of pluggable components that allow you to automate your home. And it has come from a very nascent state in the past 2 years where it was something that was deployable only by experts and people who like to dig really deeply into IoT protocols like Z-Wave and Zigbee. And it's become something that's accessible to a large number of people simply by making it easier to consume for the layman. And the way that they've gone about doing that, I think, is particularly impressive. I should also point out that NGINX is kind of in the mix in that project as well. So a lot of things to like about that. Another project I contribute to and I really love also kind of derives from the open source community, and that's a project called Node-RED. Node-RED is a no-code, low-code construction environment for gluing API sets together visually.
Ooh, cool.
And it came out of IBM and kind of escaped and has a community that's formed around it. But it makes a really interesting way to very quickly craft message exchanges in IoT in a visual way. And then you can connect them to dashboards, rich graphical dashboards. And so I enjoy tooling around with that. I enjoy trying to create new plugins for that. Both of those are really well governed, well instrumented, and attractive open source projects, I guess you would say.
You're the second person that's been on the series that's actually mentioned Home Assistant. So again, community, you might want to go take a look at this. It's getting a lot of hype inside of here.
Certainly.
But it does bring up an interesting question. A lot of our viewers and a lot of the community in general have never actually dabbled in working with open source. They use open source. How would you suggest someone get started working with open source today?
I would give 3 pieces of advice. First of all, find an open source community that curates technology that you personally are excited by. It's one thing to use it at work. It's another thing if you use it in your personal life. And so if you have something that drives you, that you're passionate about, maybe you're passionate about gaming, look for open source projects that plug into the game that you like to play, or that provide things that are interesting, an interesting diversion for you. I find that passion overrules all in the open source community. And then, meet the community. Don't just, pull the code and toss out a PR here or there. Participate in the forums. If there's a Discord, jump on it. Get to know some of the people that are passionate about the same thing you're passionate about. It makes a much easier way to pull yourself into a project. And then just pitch in. Don't just focus on the flashy things in the project that you're curating. Dig in and do some of the non-flashy things. I can't tell you how many open source projects just need someone to go through and finish out the documentation. And that's a PR that anybody's going to accept, right?
Yes.
And it's incredibly valuable, and the community loves you for it. And so even if you aren't necessarily the world's top-notch coder, if you work in your passion, If you get to know the community and if you are willing to dive in, that's the way to get started in open source.
Yeah. I have to admit that I got involved in a project called Deus once and was recommended heavily by people because I went through and just corrected all the typos in the
Yeah,
documentation. That's
yeah,
all I did.
absolutely.
So,
And it's a small thing, but it's one of those things that leads to the overall quality of the project. And the community needs more people like that.
yep.
And sometimes I think that people are shy about participating in the community because they think these people are going to critique my code, and that's going to happen. But there's also other contributions that you can make that are net positive for the community, and those are equally as important.
Cool. Joel, this has been great. You've had some wonderful insights. And again, you've heard it from Joel, our distinguished engineer here. Go check out Home Assistant for
Oh yeah,
this.
absolutely.
And with that, thank you all for joining us again for this edition of the NGINX Community Chats. If you've got your own ideas, your own thoughts, you want to give us feedback, feel free to add it to the comments below. And with that, may the open source be with you.